The last person seen with Hae-min Lee. On a cold afternoon in January 1999, a high school student finished her classes, got into her car, and then disappeared. She had plans that day, places to be, people expecting her, but she never showed up. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the last person known to have seen her alive would become the center of a case that still divides people decades later. Imagine this for a moment. You're 18 years old. School just ended. You're supposed to pick up a family member, maybe meet a friend, just a normal day. And then, somewhere between leaving school and reaching your destination, you vanish. No call, no message, no trace. Hae-min Lee was a senior at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland. She was described as outgoing, responsible, and driven. She played sports. She had a close group of friends. And, like many teenagers, she was balancing school, relationships, and plans for the future. She had recently ended a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. From the outside, it seemed like a normal teenage breakup. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, at least not at first. On January 13, 1999, Hae attended school like any other day. Classes, friends, routine. But by the end of that afternoon, something changed. Hae was supposed to pick up her younger cousin after school. It was something she did regularly, but that day she never arrived. At first, it didn't seem like an emergency. People assumed she might be delayed. Maybe she stopped somewhere. Maybe plans changed. But as hours passed, concern turned to worry. By that evening, her family knew something wasn't right. Hae was responsible. She didn't just disappear without telling anyone. Now think about this carefully. If someone who always follows a routine suddenly breaks it without explanation, what would your first instinct be? Would you assume something simple or something serious? Police were eventually notified and a missing person case began. But early on, there were very few clues. No signs of struggle. No abandoned belongings, no immediate evidence pointing in any direction. Her car was missing, she was missing, and the timeline between leaving school and disappearing was unclear. But there was one detail that investigators kept coming back to. Who saw her last? Because in cases like this, the last known interaction often becomes the most important. And that's where the focus began to shift. Witnesses recalled that Hae had been seen at school that day, talking to friends, going about her normal routine. But after school, her movements became harder to trace. Some students remembered seeing her leave, others weren't sure. Timelines started to blur, and memory, as investigators would learn, isn't always reliable. But one name kept coming up. Adnan Syed, her ex-boyfriend. He had been at school that day. He knew her schedule, and according to some accounts, he had asked her for a ride after school. That detail would become extremely important, because if he did get into her car, he may have been the last person to see her alive. Now think about this carefully. If someone asks for a ride and that person disappears shortly after, would that immediately raise suspicion for you? Or would it still feel like a coincidence? At the time, though, nothing was certain. Investigators were still trying to piece together basic information: where she went, who she spoke to, what happened in those critical hours. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there were no answers. Then, nearly a month later, a discovery was made in a wooded area in Baltimore. A body, partially buried, hidden just enough to delay discovery, but not enough to remain hidden forever. And when authorities confirmed the identity, the case changed instantly, because this was no longer a disappearance, it was a murder. But the biggest question still remained unanswered. What happened between the moment she left school and the moment her life ended? And more importantly, who was with her during that time? We'll come back to that ride request because it becomes one of the most debated details in this entire case. And as investigators continued digging, they would uncover a timeline filled with contradictions, uncertainties, and one witness whose story would change everything. In the weeks after the disappearance of Hae Min Lee, investigators began focusing on one thing above all else: the timeline.
Because somewhere between the final school bell and the time she was supposed to pick up her cousin, something had happened. And that window was small. At first, police revisited the school. They spoke to students, teachers, friends, trying to reconstruct those last known moments. Who saw her leave? Who spoke to her last? Who might have been with her? But as with many cases involving dozens of teenagers, memories were inconsistent. Some students thought they saw her, others weren't sure. Some details changed over time. And then there was that one detail, the ride request. Multiple people recalled that earlier in the day, Adnan Syed had asked Hae for a ride after school. He didn't have his car, or at least that was the explanation given. At first, this didn't seem unusual. They had dated, they knew each other well. A ride wouldn't be strange. But now, in the context of her disappearance, that simple request began to carry weight. Because if she agreed, then he may have been with her during that critical window. Now think about this carefully. If someone is the last known person to request time alone with a victim, how much should that matter in an investigation? Is that enough to suspect them, or just one piece of a much larger puzzle? When police initially spoke to Adnan, he denied asking for a ride, or at least his responses were unclear. He said he didn't remember. That day was like any other. Nothing stood out. And that answer would later become important. Because forgetting details is normal, but forgetting whether you asked someone for a ride on the day they disappeared raises questions. As investigators continued digging, another element began to emerge: phone records. Adnan had a cell phone, and in 1999, cell phones were far less common than they are today, which made those records valuable. Outgoing calls, incoming calls, tower pings. They began mapping his movements through those signals, and what they saw didn't fully match his statements. Now, cell tower data isn't always precise. It gives general locations, not exact positions, but it can still paint a picture. And the picture that began to form suggested movement across different parts of the city that day. At the same time, investigators were trying to understand Hae's final movements. Where did she go after school? Did she leave alone? Did she meet someone? There was no confirmed sighting of her after school, no witness who could definitively say, "I saw her at this time, in this place." That gap in the timeline became the center of everything. Then came a major development. A witness came forward, someone who claimed to know what happened. His name was Jay Wilds. Jay told investigators that Adnan had shown him Hae's body, that he had confessed to killing her, and that Jay himself had helped bury the body. This was the first time investigators had a direct narrative, a story connecting the victim to a suspect with details. But that story came with complications because Jay's account changed. He gave multiple versions, details shifted, timelines adjusted. Some parts remained consistent,
others didn't, and that created a dilemma. Now think about this carefully. If a key witness changes parts of their story, does that make the entire story unreliable? Or does it still hold value if some core details stay the same? Investigators believed that despite inconsistencies, Jay knew details that only someone involved would know. One of the most important details was the location of Hay's car. At that point, her car had not been found. It was a missing piece. Jay led police to the car, and that changed everything, because knowing the location of the car was something only someone with inside knowledge could have. But even that raised questions. How did Jay know? Was he telling the truth, or was there something else happening behind the scenes? As police built their case, they began connecting the dots. Ride request, phone records, witness testimony, behavior after the disappearance, and slowly the focus narrowed. Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with murder.
But even after the arrest, many questions remained unanswered. Because this case was not built on a single piece of evidence. There was no direct forensic proof, no DNA, no eyewitness to the crime itself. It was a case built on timelines, statements, interpretations. And that's where the uncertainty began to grow. Because when a case depends on interpretation, different people can see it differently. We'll come back to Jay's testimony because it becomes one of the most debated aspects of this entire case. And as the trial approaches, the question shifts from what happened to what can be proven, and whether the story being told is the truth or just one version of it. As the case moved closer to trial, the story that prosecutors would present began to take a clearer shape. It was built around a simple idea that on the afternoon of January 13, 1999, Adnan Syed had been alone with Hae Min Lee in her car, that something happened during that time, and that everything that followed was an attempt to cover it up. But the strength of that story depended heavily on one person, Jay Wilds. Jay's testimony became the backbone of the case. He told the jury that Adnan had strangled Hae, that he shown him her body in the trunk of her car, and that later that evening they buried her together in a wooded area. It was a detailed story, but it was also a story that had changed multiple times. Dates shifted, locations shifted. The sequence of events wasn't always consistent, and that raised a critical question. If a story changes, how much of it can you trust? Now think about this. If someone tells the same story but with different details each time, does that make them unreliable? Or does it mean they're trying to remember something complicated? Prosecutors argued that despite inconsistencies, Jay knew too much. Too many details that only someone involved could know. The defense saw it differently. They argued that Jay had been pressured, that his story evolved because it was shaped during police interviews, that without him, there was no case. And that was partly true, because outside of Jay's testimony, the evidence was largely circumstantial. There was no direct forensic link tying Adnan to the crime, no DNA evidence placing him at the burial site, no eyewitness to the act itself. Instead, the prosecution relied on patterns, behavior, timing, and interpretation. One of the key elements they emphasized was Adnan's behavior after Hae disappeared.
They pointed out that he did not call her, not once. Now, at first glance, that might not seem unusual. They had broken up. People move on. But prosecutors argued something different. They said that someone who had just lost contact with a close friend, someone they had recently dated, would likely try to reach out, at least once. Now think about this. If someone you cared about suddenly disappeared, would you try to call them, or would you assume everything was fine? That question became part of how jurors interpreted his actions. Then there were the phone records, calls made that day, locations suggested by cell tower data, connections between different points in the timeline. The prosecution used these to support Jay's version of events, to place Adnan in certain areas at certain times. But the defense challenged this. They argued that the cell tower data was unreliable, that incoming calls in particular could not accurately determine location. And that created another layer of uncertainty. Because now the case wasn't just about what happened, it was about how much trust to place in the evidence itself. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the case began to attract attention. People started asking questions, looking at the details, comparing timelines. Years later, the case would gain even more attention through media coverage and investigations. But even during the trial, there were already doubts. Because this wasn't a case with a single clear piece of evidence. It was a case built from pieces. And depending on how you arranged those pieces, you could see different pictures. We'll come back to one specific moment in Jay's testimony, a moment that prosecutors said proved everything. But before that, there's something else to consider. Because in cases like this, it's not just about what is said, it's about what cannot be proven. And as the trial moved toward its conclusion, the jury would have to decide between two possibilities: that the story presented to them was true, or that there were too many unanswered questions to be certain. And that decision would determine the rest of Adnan Syed's life.
As the trial of Adnan Syed moved toward an end, the case no longer revolved around just one question. It had become two: what happened to Hae Min Lee, and whether the story presented in court was enough to prove it. The prosecution stood by a clear narrative that Adnan had been with Hae after school, that something happened inside her car, and that everything that followed, the calls, the movements, the burial, was part of a plan to hide what he had done. They pointed to the ride request, to Jay Wilde's testimony, to the phone records, to behavior that, in their view, didn't match someone innocent. The defense challenged each part. They questioned Jay's changing statements. They argued the timeline didn't fully hold together. They raised doubts about the reliability of the cell tower data. And they emphasized the absence of direct physical evidence. No DNA, no eyewitness to the crime, no definitive proof placing Adnan at the exact moment Hae's life ended. Now think about this. If a case is built mostly on interpretation, how certain can a conclusion ever be? Is a consistent story enough? Or does there always need to be something more concrete? After hearing everything, the jury reached a decision. Adnan Syed was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For years, that seemed like the final chapter, a case closed, a verdict reached, a life defined by that decision. But the story didn't end there. Because over time, questions continued to surface.
Journalists revisited the case. Podcasts examined the details. New audiences looked at the same evidence and began asking the same questions all over again. Was the timeline accurate? Was Jay's testimony reliable? Did the phone records truly place Adnan where prosecutors said he was? And perhaps the biggest question of all, did the court get it right? In 2022, more than 2 decades after Hay disappeared, the case took a dramatic turn. Adnan Syed's conviction was vacated. He was released from prison. Prosecutors cited issues with the original investigation, concerns about evidence, and the possibility that alternative suspects had not been fully explored. But even then, the story didn't reach a clear ending, because later legal developments reinstated aspects of the case, and debates about guilt, innocence, and justice continued. To this day, the case remains one of the most discussed in modern true crime, and that's because it sits in a space that is uncomfortable, not fully resolved, not completely unanswered, but somewhere in between. Now think about this carefully. If you were on that jury, hearing only what was presented in that courtroom, what would you have decided? And knowing everything that came afterward, would your decision change? Because in the end, this case leaves behind something more than just a verdict. It leaves behind a question. Not just about what happened to Hae Min Lee, but about how we decide what the truth really is. Thank you for listening.